In this video, I'm gonna walk you through 10 tips to improve your photography within frozen landscapes. So let's start with tip number 1, and that is to keep your batteries warm and to bring extra batteries. So fun fact about electronics is that they will die significantly faster when exposed to colder temperatures. So if you're shooting in 10 degrees, 20 degrees, 30 degrees Fahrenheit, those batteries are gonna go much faster, especially if you're shooting video. So what I like to do is bring a couple extra batteries and I keep them in my pocket next to my leg just to keep them warm and ready to go. The second tip I have is to make sure your sensor is clean and spotless before you go out shooting in the snow. So when you're shooting in a place where there's a ton of light, this is going to expose those sensor spots on your camera very easily. So make sure your sensor is spot clean. And this also goes for places like shooting in the fog or in rainy conditions. You're gonna be able to see those sensor spots very easily, especially if you're shooting at higher f-stops. So if, for example, you go out and you realize that there are a ton of sensor spots on your camera, a way to avoid this is to shoot as low as possible. So shoot at 1.8 or f4. And then obviously you can clean it up in post-production, but it's just gonna take a while, especially if you have a ton of them. The third tip I have is to get gloves that have removable fingertips. So you can find gloves on the market that you just slip a little cover off of your fingertip, and this will allow you to keep your hands and fingers warm. But when you're working with the camera, adjusting that shutter speed, the aperture, fine-tuning the shutter button and whatnot, you can take your fingers out of the glove and work with the camera. This will save you a lot of hassle between having to take off a big glove and then put it on your camera, then put it back in. And your hand's really not gonna stay warm if you have to keep taking it out of your glove every couple minutes. And then one thing I also like to do is if it's particularly cold out, I'll bring one of those little hot packs and just keep it in my pocket. So these are little packets that you can shake. A lot of people use them when they're skiing to warm up their fingers or toes. And I just keep it in my pocket, and that way if I'm a couple miles into a hike and realize my hands are actually getting a lot colder than I thought, then I can just keep them in my pocket for a couple minutes, warm them up, and go back to shooting again. There's nothing worse than trying to shoot when your hands are near frozen and you can't even take a shot. The fourth tip I have is to use a polarizing filter. And I don't use polarizing filters very often, but I do find myself using them quite often in the snow. If you remember back to the filter video, polarizing filters help reduce the glare in shots. So if it's a particularly bright day out, that sun reflecting off the snow is going to overexpose your images very easily. So you can use a polarizing filter to help reduce that glare intensity coming into your camera. Additionally, you can just avoid this altogether by shooting on cloudy days, and it's gonna be much easier to get those shots exposed correctly. The fifth tip I have is to go shoot right after fresh snowfall. So even just an hour or two after the snow stops, this is when the photography is best because you're gonna get the snow when it's in its most light and delicate form, which looks best in landscape photography. So the snow hasn't had a chance to melt yet. It's still hanging off of trees and leaves in very subtle ways, and it hasn't started to drip or droop at all, and there's no footprints around, there's no trails, there's no animals that have run through things, there's no leaves that have polluted the top of the snow. It's just clean and precise. So if you can go right after snowfall, this is gonna be your best time for pristine photography. The next tip I have is to watch where you're stepping. So don't just arbitrarily walk into a fresh field of snow. Keep in mind that it could be a brilliant composition that you're walking right into. So you wanna save that snow so there's not footprints in it when you take a photo. So just be mindful of where you're stepping. It's kind of similar to sand in that notion, especially if you're in a very touristy area, you're probably gonna have to go pretty far off the tracks of where people have walked unless you get there very early or right after the snowfall. The seventh tip I have is to use a lens microfiber towel to wash off your lens and a lens hood, especially if the snow is blowing. So I know I've talked about this in several videos before, but I cannot stress how important it is to not have water on your lens. It can mess up really great compositions, and there's nothing worse than getting home thinking you have a great shot, then realizing you have a giant splotch of water right in the center of the shot. So you always want to be checking that lens and making sure it's clean. The eighth tip I have is for shooting falling snowflakes. So generally you want to shoot somewhere between 1/250th of a second and above if you want to get those snowflakes frozen in midair. However, you can get a little lower if you want to start to get more of a rainy-esque effect. But For those precision little light, delicate ones, you're gonna wanna shoot at those higher shutter speeds. Another way you could help illuminate those is by using an external flash. So if your camera has an external flash, put it over the top and then shoot that flash and it will illuminate those snowflakes right in front of you. So this will help make them look much more prevalent in the scene, especially if you're shooting at something like a lower f-stop. And then finally, you also might want to add snowflakes in post-production. So depending on what kind of settings you're using in your camera, you might not always get snowflakes even if you think you are. So worst case scenario, you could always find filters and mess around with brushes in Photoshop in order to subtly add snowflakes into the scene to make your scene pop a little bit more. The ninth tip I have is for shooting individual snowflakes. So say you have a snowflake land on your mitten, or you see a little bunch of snowflakes on a leaf that you want to get a close-up macro shot of. The best way to do this is to get an extension tube for your lens. So this will allow you to be able to focus on those snowflakes because they are so small and precise. You would think you'd be able to do this with a macro lens, but a lot of macro lenses actually don't have the capability to get a snowflake in a shot. And this is because you want to be aiming for a 2-to-1 magnification on your focus. Another way you can do this is to get magnification filters for your lenses to help zoom in a bit more. But I found that these can provide some optical issues. So I found that extensions are the best way to do this. And essentially you set your aperture at something in the middle ground like f11 or f13 or something, and then you set your camera on a tripod, get a individual snowflake isolated, and aim and shoot. And depending on what your settings are and what type of magnification system you're using, you might need to focus stack that shot. So keep in mind that depth of focus is going to be very small because it's such a flat object. But generally, if you can get it as flat as you can, so say you're shooting exactly like this angle as opposed to a side angle like this, you're going to have a much better time getting that snowflake in focus. One final tip is to make sure that snowflake is well lit. And a lot of extension tubes actually come with a small ring light at the end to help ensure that you are exposing it properly. So just one final thing to keep in mind. The last tip I have is for when you're done shooting in very cold temperatures. And this is to bag your camera. So by this, I mean have a plastic Ziploc bag. And once you're done shooting in the cold, put your entire camera inside that bag while you're outside in the cold and Ziploc it shut. Then you can bring that bag into your house and slowly acclimate that camera back to a normal temperature. If you just bring that camera right into a warm temperature after you've been shooting in the freezing cold, there's going to be a lot of condensation that's going to appear on your camera, and depending on how weather sealed your camera and lens are, this could help ruin parts of the lens and the camera body. So the way to avoid this is just put your camera in a bag and give it an hour or two to acclimate to that temperature before you take it out. So those are my 10 tips for shooting in frozen landscapes. Let's go ahead and hop into the next video.